Welcome back to the Health Physics Society's video series pursuing the truth and promoting transparency regarding the historical foundations of the current radiation protection philosophy based on a linear no threshold theory for cancer risk assessment. I'm Dr. John Cardarelli, President of the Health Physics Society. In the 15th episode, we learned about the differences between the US and the British reports associated with radiation risk and genetic mutations, a fractured relationship between James Neel and Hermann Muller, and Muller's attempt to censor Neel's presentation from the Copenhagen World Health Organization conference proceedings, how the British scientists rally behind Neel and his work, and Warren Weaver's promise for more money should the results of this work justify it, and his conspirators remark. In this episode, the new chair of the National Academy of Sciences Genetics Panel, George Beadle, comes up with a way to refocus the panel, and we're introduced to a new geneticist that produces the most influential paper in risk assessment that impacted U.S. policy. What was George Beadle's message to the panel that refocused their efforts? And who is this new person that published such an influential paper? Let's find out.
What comes next? Neel's paper is out there, and there's two sides to this story. Where does it go from there?
Well, what happened was that Neel's work really just eviscerated the credibility of the recommendation to go linear for mutational effects. I mean, it's one thing to study fruit flies at very high doses, but it's another thing to take a look at 70,000 humans that were exposed within an atomic bomb setting, and 10 years of study haven't shown a significant effect. And where this was suppressed, and now it's open, and so where does that leave the committee? And so it left the committee in shambles. And so now with their new committee chair, George Beadle, he's going to try to figure out how to salvage this committee and how to redirect it, and how to how can you reconcile Neel now, having called Muller out, and Muller trying to, during this whole process, Muller's threatening Neel's career. I mean, it gets pretty ugly in this whole framework where you have to call in your friends to defend yourself, and then you have to come back and play nice. And so this is a difficult challenge for George Beadle. And so, but Beadle became a Nobel Prize winner, as I mentioned, and he's a very bright guy. And he figured out a strategy on how to move forward, because you had to now find a common enemy. And the common enemy that they could probably all be concerned with wasn't really the mutational side, because they were now going to agree to disagree, however that was going to be. And but the new enemy now was cancer. And so what he did was and the new enemy was the AEC. And the AEC wasn't protecting the American public. The AEC was, with probably other aspects of government, they had this very active above ground nuclear testing in Nevada, dozens and dozens and dozens of above ground tests, and with concerns over not just birth defects, but concerns over cancer and effects on little kids and things of that nature. And then you had, Linus Pauling, who was strongly advocating, this as a concern. So you had different actions. And so what happened was that in July of 1955, Beadle tried to activate a faculty within his biology division, because he was the chair of the biology division at Caltech at that time. And his co-equal, you might say, was Linus Pauling, who was the head of chemistry and chem engineering at that time. So Beadle writes a memo, and he says, we have a serious problem with above ground testing, and I'd really like to have our faculty look into this and see if you can find something and learn what are the public health and other implications of all this, because that's a very serious matter. And he raised concerns with leukemia in his write-up, and so
did he have any evidence for that at the time, or was he just speculating this could be an effect?
No, well, his evidence was he cited radiologists. And there was a study of radiologists that suggested that their risk of developing leukemia was about 10-fold higher, very much higher than other physicians, that sort of thing. So he wasn't an epidemiologist, but he was putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with 4 and trying to, motivate his faculty to do something. And that was coming on the heels of this talk that I mentioned earlier by, Alfred Sturtevant within his department that challenged the AEC and was claiming that there was effects all the way down to, essentially almost zero exposure, just about zero exposure, mutational effects. And so they were in the same school and the same department. And so what happened is that very few, almost nobody decides to take up the challenge from George Beadle, but one person does. It's a young professor by the name of Edward B. Lewis. And Lewis was a Drosophila geneticist, okay?
There's a lot more of those than I thought there were.
And so he was, an eager young, professor trying to do good things in the genetics of Drosophila. But he got very motivated to try to do something on the fallout question, as he called it. And so in November of 1955, he writes a first draft of a fallout memo that he then circulates, in which he tries to take a look at the effects of fallout. And even though he's a geneticist and interested in mutation, he's now riveted on the potential concerns with leukemia. And the concerns are coming out of some preliminary studies out of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission work in Japan that is indicating that there's an increase, significant increase in leukemia from people who were exposed to the bomb, especially fairly closer up to the bomb. And so he had concerns with that, and then he was playing that out over into what was happening in this country. And so he began to put together a working paper. And so I got a hold of the working paper, and I would have to say that November 1955 working paper by Lewis, and this is before the big brouhaha. This is 1955. The Baer Committee is just being put together for their first meeting. It was really a pretty inconsequential piece of work. It was the equivalent of an average, master's student's term paper in a course that I might be teaching. It really wasn't a strong effort. And so when I read it, I could tell that, and this is not to be demeaning to Edward B. Lewis, it just told me that Lewis wasn't that motivated. He kind of got a little motivated, but not too much, and he had probably other things going on. So, and nothing really happened with that. And then what happened is the Baer Committee that Beadle is part of, and the controversies, and then the explosion in the summer of 1956. And what I believe happened is that Beadle came back, shared his concerns with Edward Lewis, who was in his department, and got him motivated again. And he did get motivated, and he then greatly expanded his paper. And his paper now became a fully...
Was he doing a population study? Or was it all theory?
It was all theory. And he's a lab-based guy. He's a Drosophila person. He's not an epidemiologist. He doesn't really understand radiation. He doesn't know dosimetry. He doesn't know he doesn't know epidemiology for that matter. He doesn't know biostatistics and low-dose extrapolation. He's a laboratory geneticist working with fruit flies. And that's it's got its own technical issues associated with it, but it's hard to go outside your discipline and capture all these other complex disciplines and assimilate them within 2 or 3 months, all on your own, while you have your other, your teaching and all your other research going on, and to be competitive at a national level. And so, but nonetheless, what he does is Beadle redirects him to focus on cancer, because cancer's the big issue. And so what happened is that he develops a a substantial manuscript in early November of 1956, just when all this craziness is happening between Muller and Neel. And so he focuses on leukemia of the atomic bomb victims, and then he is trying to develop a quantitative relationship so that he can predict the amount of leukemia risk based upon a linear dose response. And he is doing this with the data that he has obtained from the published studies, but also his boss, who was George Beadle, was an advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission and on the committees that were overseeing the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. So he was able to get unpublished data that was passed through to him from his boss. And so his boss was motivating him even further in that direction. But he knew that he had to strengthen this. And so he wanted to expand it to another group that got exposed to ionizing radiation. And this was a group called the ankylosing spondylitis patients. And they were treated with very high doses of radiation into the bone marrow. And they had doses that went as high as 250 rads to their bone marrow. And they developed risks of leukemia. And so he was expanding his cohort from not just the Japanese victims, but to the ankylosing spondylitis people. And then he wanted to also expand it further because it would strengthen the case. And so he took the recommendation from Beadle to look at the radiologists that Beadle had cited earlier. And then there was a fourth group. It was children that had an enlarged thymus. And kids who had an enlarged thymus back in the day, that's, I'm going to say up until the 40s, and late 40s, maybe even into the early 50s, they were treated with X-rays to reduce the size of their thymus. Now you might wonder, why would the medical profession expose children with an enlarged thymus with X-rays? And actually that started around, believe it or not, back in 1830, not with X-rays, but there was a concern with an enlarged thymus and sudden infant death syndrome. And I never would have thought that sudden infant death syndrome, the concern went back to the 1830s, but it actually did. And
I didn't realize that either.
And they called the condition thymic asthma. So back in the day, why did the child die? They really didn't know why the child died in the crib. But a perfectly healthy child, parents go and see him the next morning and the child has died. And so a theory came to be that it was due to some type of thing that they caused, and probably an air passageway, constriction or something, and they called it thymic asthma. And so this became a belief system in the 1800s in this country and elsewhere. And then by the end of the 1800s, it was still viewed within that context, but a bit broader, and that something would cause a vascular collapse in the child. And they ended up changing the terminology from thymic, asthma to thymico-lymphaticus, some medical condition. And just at about that time, of course, Rankin, has his discovery with X-rays in 1895 or so, or 6, and the people looking for applications. And by as early as 1905 to 1910, radiologists and so forth began treating children with X-rays to try to shrink the thymus. And so this is kind of how it started. And there's a unique history to it. And ultimately this becomes associated with the risk of cancer. And if you look at the population studies going along those lines, you find that because the thyroid gland is close to the thymus, that there are in the scatter of X-rays and so forth, and some of these kids were at increased risk of thyroid cancer, and some of the females became at increased risk to breast cancer. And these things have all played out within the scientific literature, and it's no longer done, but it was done. And Edward B. Lewis utilized those data within his paper. And so what he wanted to do was to prove that X-rays, ionizing radiation were a cause of leukemia. He chose 4 different groups to look at: the Japanese victims, the radiologist, the ankylosing spondylosis people, and the thymus enlargement children. And so, but he did the Japanese ones first. And so what happened in this is that he put this paper together, minus the radiologist and minus the thymus ones, and he sent this paper to the Bear 1 committee in late November of 1956 and wanted their comments, and got a series of comments back from them. And he actually used some of the exposure data of Neel, not the effects data, but the exposure data to help him on some of his own evaluations. And so there was this, and he was strongly supported by the comments that I saw by the Bear committee, Muller and others. And then what happens is that he fleshes out his paper, and he submits it to the Journal of Science, the top journal again, and he gets it accepted. And it's a major paper, and it gets an editorial endorsement from the editor-in-chief saying that this is the most significant paper. Dr. Lewis has shown us how to estimate cancer risk to the very, very lowest of exposures, and there's no level of exposure that's safe, and that radiation exposure is a major cause of leukemia.
In the studies he looked at, the doses weren't actually low. Is that correct?
Well, in the studies that he looked at, when it comes to, and this is going to be the opening, this is what's going to be what the critics are going to write. The critics are going to point out that, in fact, when we'll take, for example, ankylosing spondylitis. The doses that the bone marrow were getting were at 250 rads. It's a massive exposure. And to try to translate that into low-dose exposures and risk is really almost impossible to do. And that the study on the ankylosing spondylitis patients were done by British epidemiologists who are quite good, and was funded by the major medical research council of Britain. And I got the reports from them, and in the preface of those reports, it's very interesting. They claim that they were hoping that this funded study would help give insight into low-dose exposures and leukemia risk. And the medical council concluded that it was the researchers did the best they could do, but they could not answer that question, and it could not be applied in that framework. And then I got the actual paper by the investigators, and they said the exact same thing. Now, when Edward B. Lewis writes his paper, does he share with the readership of Science that the funding group, which is a very prestigious medical funding group in Britain, and the investigators themselves, did they support the application of their work for low-dose cancer risk assessment? And of course, I know they said that it could not be applied. Does he share that? No, he doesn't share that. He applies it with his own methodology. And so now, I don't mind if he disagreed with them, but tell me how you disagreed and why you disagreed. He doesn't. He just uses it when they said it shouldn't have been used that way. Now, when it comes to the enlarged thymus, the same situation actually occurs again, except it's even more explicit in this particular case, where they said there was no relationship between exposure to the X-rays in this treatment and the occurrence of leukemia. They were very absolutely explicit. And what does he do? He uses that data. Now, I don't mind if he used the data, but tell me why you disagreed with the authors. But he doesn't share that. He doesn't share the disagreement with the authors or their opinions and the basis of it. And then when it comes to the radiologist that he was using, well, he used data that went back to the 1910s and 20s. And the collective dose that these radiologists had over time in a career was over 2,000 rads. It was massively high. And the relevance of that to his situation and coming up with low-dose risk was pretty much laughable. And he was, his work was really strongly criticized by experts, from the outside who wrote into both Science as well as into other journals criticizing him. But I have to tell you that the Lewis paper was very significant because he gets a major editorial endorsement, by the Science editor, and within a week, I think within a week, it was discussed fully at Meet the Press on Sunday morning. Ed Lewis, they had I think it was the director of the AEC was on being interviewed, and almost the whole half hour was about the Ed Lewis paper. That was like May 17th, the publication came on. And then on June 3rd, which is within 2 weeks, Ed Lewis was brought into Congress to testify in front of Congress on it. And then by June 10th, Life magazine ran a whole big story on radiation low dose and big pictures of Ed Lewis. So he became like a media star overnight, despite the fact that there was all kinds of criticisms about him. Now, and he would come back and testify, in other congressional hearings on this point. But when you take a look at what he did in his studies, you can see that he has a certain bias and actually a certain amount of, it's either inexperience or dishonesty, or a combination of both, where he has such a bias that he wants to see a result and to prove his case, that he's not honest in sharing the reservations of people who are real experts on their own data and how it can and cannot be used, and he won't share that with the readership. And that the reviewers of Science, if it was reviewed at all, should have been aware of that. A top journal doesn't know what these other people are saying. It's hard for me to even envision that this is true. And then when he tries to justify a mechanistic linkage between mutation and cancer. And so what does he do? He uses the Neel study to get information on exposure, but he doesn't use the Neel data on mutation because it wouldn't have supported his case. And so what he does is that he then links the mechanism back to the Delta Uphoff and Spencer papers, I view the discredited fruit fly studies of the Manhattan Project, and he uses that to justify the mechanistic linkage to the cancer. And yet those studies, he doesn't see the problem here. Those studies are really done with mature spermatozoa. They don't have DNA repair. They can't really predict very well what happens in a somatic cell. And that's the one that he uses. There are so many problems with his study, and basically, but he creates a gigantic brouhaha. And I remembered when I was getting involved with these low-dose effects back in the early 1990s, and there was a gentleman, a physician by the name of Leonard Sagan, and a very distinguished person. He was the medical director of the Electric Power Research Institute. And Sagan, I remember exactly what he said. Ed, he says, the most important paper in cancer risk assessment that affects policy in this country, he said, was the Ed Lewis study in Science in 1957. It just changed everything. It just changed everything.
That paper and the paper out of the Genetics Committee, both published in Science.
That's right.
Both had this huge impact on where we are today. And both seriously flawed, if not dishonest.
Thank you for watching the 16th episode on the historical foundations of the linear no threshold theory, where we learned George Beadle's message to focus on cancer brings new purpose to the group. As the new chair of the Genetics Panel, he challenges professors at his university to look into leukemia and radiation exposures, and one takes up the challenge, Dr. Edward Lewis, a fruit fly geneticist at Caltech. Under Beadle's guidance, Lewis has access to unpublished data on the atomic bomb survivors. Lewis also extends the subjects of his study to include radiologists, ankylosing spondylitis patients, and children treated with X-rays to reduce an enlarged thymus gland. Lewis's paper receives support and praise by members of the Genetics Panel and is published in Science, concluding that there is a relationship between radiation exposure and leukemia. Lewis doesn't share limitations of the data sets on the radiologist ankylosing spondylitis patients, and children treated with X-rays to reduce enlarged thymus glands, whose authors explicitly warned against using these data to address cancer at low doses. He provides no explanation for his exclusions. Was it because he lacked epidemiological training, or was he motivated by something else? We may never know, but we do know his paper received unprecedented endorsement by the chief editor of Science, and within a few weeks, he was testifying in front of Congress, and this paper was the focus of discussion on Meet the Press, a national syndicated news program. His science paper was later referred to as the most important paper on cancer risk assessment affecting U.S. policy. In the next episode, we take a closer look at the original atomic bomb survivor study, something you don't want to miss. The HPS is a trusted source of radiation information. We're a scientific organization, and as is offered with a scientific peer review process, viewers are encouraged to send comments or suggested corrections to factcheck@hps.org, and be sure to include your sources so that we may correct the record if necessary. If any changes are made, they will appear at the end of this episode. Please visit our Ask the Experts website to ask questions or seek answers to common radiation-related questions, and view our fact sheets. We also have official position statements that can be found at hps.org. Finally, if you wish to join the home for radiation protection professionals, please visit the link below. We welcome you.